Hey everyone, Keto Comic here. This one's an interesting one. This is one that I've studied for quite a while just because I thought it was kind of a funny case, but it deals with fruitcakes and $16.5 million worth of embezzlement. In fact, it's one of the largest single person embezzlement cases in the history of the United States. Let's get into it. This case deals primarily with two individuals. Sandy Jenkins, pictured here, to my right, and his wife Kay. Sandy was born to two shopkeepers in the town of Wortham, Texas in 1949. His parents owned the only grocery store in town, and as a result, Sandy lived a pretty privileged childhood. He had an upper middle class life, was kind of a quiet child, did well in school. In high school, even though he was shy and not really what you consider popular, he was voted most fashionable in 1956 because of his style. He always dressed very well, like the finer things, would buy designer clothes as well as buy vintage clothes from thrift shops, just very much into fashion. And interesting thing about Sandy, he didn't want to follow in his parents' footsteps. In fact, they dissuaded him from going into the grocery store business. They said it was too rough, the margins were too thin, and why doesn't he become a doctor or a teacher or go into business? But that's not what Sandy wanted to do. He actually wanted to be a funeral director and a mortician. And he actually interned at a relative's funeral home in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and did very well. But his parents kind of dissuaded him from that. They thought it was kind of weird. And there's a little confession for me. At one point, I wanted to be a mortician. I think it's kind of cool. Maybe it's a certain type of personality that likes that sort of thing, but that's what Sandy wanted to do. But unfortunately, his parents didn't agree, and they persuaded him to pursue something else. So, after graduating from Wortham High School in 1956, he entered Dallas Christian College in Dallas, Texas, and there pursued a degree in business and accounting. There he met Kay Nickel, who was studying to be a dental hygienist, and he worked up the courage to ask her out to a movie in Waco, Texas, and it was pretty much a couple from day one. They eventually got married in 1971, and upon graduating from college, they moved to Fairfield, Texas, where Sandy got a job as an accounting clerk for the power utility and worked there until 1995. And that says 1945. It's supposed to say 1995. Sorry, I was thinking about World War II, evidently. But one thing that Fairfield offered Kay and Sandy was an opportunity to see the finer things in life. In fact, Sandy was once quoted as saying, living in Fairfield, Texas, and being part of a power utility, because when you're in a public utility or anything connected with the government at all, you usually get connected with the upper echelons of any town. So they got to see the finer things in life. Even though they didn't make a whole lot of money, they got to see how the jet set lived, the rich people lived. And they said that it was like being in an episode of Real Housewives. All the gossip, all the stuff that went on. And they got very much sucked into that and tried to live way above their means. And as a result, they had a lot of frustration. By this time they had one daughter and were raising her, but they still wanted to be part of this jet set group of people. Kay, who had given up being a dental hygienist to start her own catering company in hopes of breaking in, catered all the most exclusive weddings in town and kind of got caught up in that. She started a book club so she could hobnob with the richest women in town. And they really had, and Sandy did too. He bought a used Lexus. He bought Kay a used Lexus. He bought a really expensive watch, what would have been really expensive watches in their heyday. He bought older watches at Goodwills and thrift markets and had a pretty impressive watch collection worth about $15,000 that he picked up from secondhand stores. So he really craved having the good life, but could never quite afford it because he only made around $25,000 a year working for the power utility. And due to the power of going from manual bookkeeping to computerized bookkeeping, his job was eliminated in 1995. So in 1995, after he had been laid off, they got really, really involved in their Baptist church. Sandy and Kay would cater a lot of the Sunday dinners. Sandy would help her around the church. He would do contract work for various members of the church and tried to do everything he could to network to find another job because times were hard. In the meantime, the nearby town of Corsica, Texas, housed what has come to be known as a pretty famous business, the Collins Street Bakery, which was founded by the McNutt family in 1946. Now, the McNutts, Bill Sr., actually bought it from a German immigrant in 1946 after having already been there since the 1800s, and he outfitted it to make fruitcakes. And before you laugh, yes, the Collins Street Bakery Deluxe Fruitcake is an American staple. This is stuff that was ordered mail order from all over the world. I mean, some of this stuff was sent to Buckingham Palace. That's how popular it was. It was sent to presidents. It was ordered by presidents. It was featured in the movie The Godfather. If you remember, the red tin that this fruitcake came in was actually one of those was actually sitting on Michael Corleone's kitchen in The Godfather. That's how much of a part of Americana this fruitcake was. And to top it off, the McNutt family went one step further. They created their own pecan company, for which they bought all the nuts for their fruitcake, and they started both a mango and a banana plantation in Costa Rica so that they could control the produce that went into their fruitcake. So this thing was expensive. We're talking like a $75 fruitcake here. It ain't just your, it ain't your grandma's fruitcake. So this fruitcake was literally the main source of finance and economy for the town of Corsica, Texas, for many, many, many years. And so Collins Street Bakery had a level of prominence in the town. And lucky for Sandy Jenkins, the CFO went to his church. And he actually brought Sandy in and introduced him to then CEO Bob McNutt, who was Bill's son, and said, "How about we hire him for the open accounting clerk position we have?" And they said, "Why not?" And they gave Sandy a job with benefits, making, again, $25,000 a year at probably the most prestigious employer in the town of Corsica had to offer. He started work for them in 1997 and was a model employee. He worked very closely with the accounting supervisor, Scott Holloman. They became like brothers. The Jenkins and the Hollamans went out together. They went to the country club together because he was an employee and an executive level employee because he worked very hard. And after about 5 years was promoted to controller, which would be second only to the CFO himself. As an executive level employee, like the other executives at Collins Street, he was awarded with a country club membership. So he and Kay were able to go out and experience more about the finer things in life, but that wasn't enough. Sandy said he would sit around and watch the other executives drive up in Lexuses and BMWs, Porsches, brand new ones, walk in designer clothes, have vacation homes, take lavish vacations, and he couldn't afford any of it because even as controller, his salary, though doubled, was still $50,000 a year, and that certainly wasn't enough to afford him a seven-figure lifestyle, which is what he really craved. So he said he was sitting around the office one day about to do payroll, so he saw the amounts of money some of these other executives were paid, and he was happened to be thumbing through a a high lifestyle magazine, and he saw all the things in it, and he said, "Why can't I have something like this?" So he started out really simply by simply dipping into petty cash. He would take a couple of hundred here, 300 or 400 over here. He got more and more bold as time went on, but since he had helped move them from manual accounting to computerized accounting while he had been there and was promoted to controller, as a result of that, there was no checks and balances. He literally did everything. He not only wrote all the checks for the company, did payroll, he also balanced the books, took care of petty cash, so there was no checks and balances. And since he was so buddy-buddy with his supervisor, no one ever caught that this petty cash came up missing, so he got more and more bold. And then he realized, I can do a heck of a lot better than just a couple of $100 in my wallet every week. Why don't I just buy some stuff and have the bakery pay for it? So that's what happened next. He went up to a luxury car dealer in Dallas, Texas, which was pretty near Corsicana, and traded in his used Lexus, which he was saving to upgrade it, traded it in on a newer model Lexus, though still a used car, to the tune of $20,000, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but in 2004, when he actually started dipping into the money and petty cash and things like that, it was still a significant amount of money, more than he could afford, because it was literally right at half of his yearly salary. So he went up and paid for it on a credit card, drove back to work, sat down, opened up QuickBooks. Now, if you've ever ran a accounting software, this is how it works. Most of the time you write checks, laser printed checks, directly from a QuickBooks or other accounting software. And usually the electronic signature of the person that signs the checks, in this case Bob McNutt, the CEO, is automatically laser imprinted on every check. This prevents them from having to sit and literally sign 1,000 checks. I used to be co-owner of a business where I wrote all the checks, and literally my business partner, who was the signer on our bank account, got sick of signing literally 300 checks every 2 weeks. So we got a rubber stamp, and I would literally sit there and stamp them as they came off, and then eventually got the laser signature in the accounting software. But Bob McNutt's signature was already in there. So literally, Sandy wrote the check, printed the check, mailed the check. And when you write a check, it's automatically logged in the QuickBooks ledger so that it can be printed out and audited later, usually in a checks and balances system where you have somebody checking somebody else's work. But that wasn't happening here. Remember that. So what Sandy was able to do is write out a check to his credit card company in the amount of $20,000, printed the check, then went back into QuickBooks and voided the check. Now, when you void a check, it wipes it off the ledger, the general ledger, which is the general accounting record, and places it on a voided check report. Now, on most QuickBooks programs, voided checks do not print out as part of a normal audit. This is something that you literally have to go in and pull that separate report to see the checks. And he knew, because he did all of the bookkeeping, that that would never happen. So he felt quite safe in doing this. So he put the check in an envelope and mailed it to his credit card company, essentially paying off his new Lexus. In the meantime, he has still had to account for that $20,000 leaving the account, and in this time, the bakery was in a time of expansion. Not only were they expanding their produce and nut companies, they were also marketing a cooking solutions company, and also making the transition from fruitcakes, which were going downhill in popularity, to standalone bakeries and coffee shops. So they were in the process of opening up 4 standalone bakeries all over Texas. So he knew that the expenses were rising, so he was able to literally go in, because Collins Street still did do some of their fruitcake marketing. He knew that when they bought supplies, he knew when they wrote checks for things to make the fruitcakes and other things. He also knew when they mailed out their mailers, especially at Christmas time, to market their fruitcakes. And so what he would do is, after he voided that check, he would go in, write another check right after that, print that check so that it still appeared in the ledger, then shred that check. So he had a check of the same amount in the ledger accounting for that money leaving. Now, one thing, QuickBooks does sequentially number checks, and you can't really change a check number manually without messing up a bunch of stuff, and he knew that. So he basically let it be known that there was a glitch in the system where sometimes a check would be off by 1 digit. And because he was the all-knowing accounting guru, people took this as law and didn't really question it. And so he mailed the check, paid off his Lexus, and waited. A few months went by, no one caught it, no one questioned it, and he started doing it regularly. Same procedure. He would write a check, he would pay for stuff on his credit card. He would write a check to the credit card company paying it off, or even just to cash sometimes. Print out the check, mail it, or go cash it, and then he would void that check, write another check, one digit different than the actual check, shred that check so that it was accounted for on the general ledger. And he did that to the tune of eventually $16.5 million. Let's get into what he spent this money on, shall we? All right, y'all. Here are some of the things that Sandy spent that money on. At one point, he had charged over $11 million on a Black American Express card. If you don't know what that is, it's the American Express Black card. You have to be invited to receive it. It's for people that have spent X amount of dollars, usually on an American Express Gold card over the past year, and they see you're a high spender. So you have to be invited to get this card, and it literally has no limit. That's why he was able to charge so much on it. So he had charged $11 million in random purchases on an American Express Black card over the 9 years that this fraud took place from 2004 to 2013. He spent $1.2 million on Neiman Marcus in Dallas. He had a personal shopper who actually called him Fruitcake and his wife Cupcake, and literally ran out of things to sell them because they would buy anything that the personal shopper would push, including bracelets, cufflinks, earrings, handbags, 16 furs for K, 9 sets of pearls, 55 rings, 98 watches that had, because he went right back to his old ways of collecting watches, this time the good stuff, the Rolexes, to the value of about $3.5 million. They also developed a taste for expensive wine, renovating their kitchen with a full Viking kitchen and a wine cellar. And they had a wine collection valued at $50,000. In fact, people at the country club would note that instead of drinking the house wine like they normally did, they would now bring in this expensive wine and pay a corkage fee from their own collection because the house wine was no longer good enough. He was always an avid pianist, so he bought a Steinway piano valued at almost $60,000. They bought a vacation home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, valued at $750,000, paid cash for it, and booked private charter jets to Aspen, Cozumel, Napa. Jet setters, they were living a 7-figure lifestyle on a mid-range 5-figure lifestyle because they were embezzling millions from Collins Street Bakery. And automobiles. He had Lexuses, Porsches, Mercedes-Benz, Bentleys, high-end GMCs, everything that you can think of, he had. Now, I know what you're thinking. Were people around that town stupid or something? Let's talk about that. People were questioning where all this newfound wealth was coming from. Sandy told a myriad of lies, even to Kay. He told Kay that not to worry where the money came from, and she asked him, could you get in trouble for this money? But he said, no, but if I ever die, the money goes away. Which leads me to believe that she kind of knew something, but she says not. But anyway, so he was lying to her, and Kay kind of felt uncomfortable. So whenever she would get a new car, like she would literally trade for a new Lexus every year. She would get it in the same color, just get a newer model so people wouldn't realize how often she got a new car. But not Sandy. He traded every 4 or 5 months and got exactly the luxury car he wanted. Of course, people started questioning where all of his Armani suits, his expensive watches, his cars were coming from, and he told so many lies he couldn't even remember. We both inherited money from a dead relative. I won some money in the lottery. I'm a car trader, so I buy the stuff way below cost and am able to get a new car and flip it and resell it every 4 or 5 months. So he was bragging to his coworkers, to Scott Holloman. He was bragging to him, taking Scott and his wife out with them to Santa Fe, to all these places bragging. He was bragging to Bob McNutt because everybody said he had a kind of a jealousy for Bob McNutt because it was Bob's father, Bill, that originally hired him. And after he died, Bob took over the company. And he said that Bob was spoiled, had a silver spoon in his mouth, didn't really earn his money. So he was very jealous of Bob and his money. And Bob was starting to question him. Why are you bragging to me? I barely know you about these cars. Why do you feel the need to tell me? So there was a lot of weird stuff going on, but still, the bakery was a family-owned business, and so they still had that air of trust, and still no one questioned what was going on with the money. Although Bob McNutt started to wonder why they weren't profiting as much as they should. They weren't losing money, but they weren't as far in the black as Bob McNutt knew they should be, and he was looking at labor costs, he was looking at supplier costs, he was looking everywhere but for wrongdoing in the accounting department. And that went on for a long time until they hired this young lady, Symmetric Walker, in 2011. And she was told, just like everybody else, there's a glitch in the accounting software, so you do have checks that are sometimes one digit off. Don't think anything of it. And so she kind of took that and went with it until June 20th, 2013, when she was doing an audit that she had not been instructed to do, but just felt it was good accounting practice. She actually found a check in the register written for $20,000. When she checked the bank account, she found a check one digit off from that check that was in the register for $20,000, which led her to believe it was the same check because of the glitch, but it was only $10,000. So she said there's something fishy here. So she brought a copy of the check to her boss, Sandy, who she said that his face went ghostly pale, and he said, oh, I actually had to write that. I had to put stamps for our postage for our latest batch of mailings on my credit card because they wouldn't take a check, and then I wrote the check to pay off the credit card. And she said that made no sense to her because they've never had a problem writing a check at the post office. So she told him she accepted. The next day, he took a day off to go house hunting. He's evidently oblivious here. And she decided to dig a little deeper. So she started looking at the register versus what was leaving the account. And she started noticing that a lot of checks weren't written to vendors that she recognized. American Express, Capital One, Citibank, Bank of America. She knew immediately that the company had no accounts with any of these entities, and so something was fishy. She printed out all those canceled checks, because if you go into a bank, most banks, they'll let you print out canceled checks. So she printed out all these questionable checks, and then she decided to check the voided check register, and there she found the corresponding checks for all those, which showed they had been written, printed, and then voided out to avoid appearing on the general ledger. She took all of this to Scott Holloman, who was now the CFO, who said that his face also went pale, and he took it to Bob McNutt and said that it appears Sandy has been embezzling money. He said all Bob said was, well, that explains a lot. The next day, June 21st, 2013, they took Sandy into the office and asked him to explain all the checks, and he said, I don't know where those came from. And they kept questioning him more, and he said, look, I'm not admitting to anything, but if I say I did it, will it make this go easier? They immediately fired him, and they said that they'd already called the sheriff. So he immediately went home to his three-story colonial. He told Kay that the jig was up, that their source of money had been cut off, he had been fired, and do not question him, but help him gather up a lot of their valuables. So they gathered up reusable grocery bags, and they put Rolexes, furs, gold bars, all kinds of jewelry in it, and they drove immediately to their house in Santa Fe, and then hid it there for a while, then drove to their daughter's house in Austin and gave her the two bags and said, please hang on to these, don't tell anybody that you had him. Well, their daughter was kind of worried about what was going on because she knew her father had just been fired for supposed financial improprieties. So she talked to her lawyer, and he recommended they give the money back, the bags back. So she gave it back to her father. He then took it down to Ladyburg Lake in the middle of Austin, and dumped all the contents into the bottom with the anticipation of coming back for it later. He then returned to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and eventually returned home to Corsicana. And in March of 2014, his house was officially searched by the FBI. They seized everything in it. They seized his bank accounts, froze his bank accounts, arrested he and Kay. They charged him with 20 counts of wire fraud, lying to a financial institution, and general embezzlement, and they booked Kay for accessory to all of the above. In September of 2015, Kay was sentenced to 5 years probation because she immediately filed for divorce because of coerce and claimed that she did not know what was going on and immediately turned state's evidence against her husband, but of course, and so was sentenced to 5 years probation, no jail time. He, Sandy Jenkins, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison because wire fraud is a federal offense, and was sentenced to the men's prison in Fort Worth, Texas, where he died March 2019 at the age of 70. And that's how the saga ended. All of their homes and property were sold at auction or sold on the general market, and the bakery was able to recoup about $4 million of the $16.5 million that was stolen. They have since promoted Miss Walker to comptroller and have instituted a series of checks and balances to prevent that from ever happening again. And that's the story of the sweetest heist. What do you guys think? You think Kay knew what was going on? Give me your opinion down below. Thanks a lot, guys. I'm really enjoying this 31 days of Ketoween. I'll be back soon with another video. Ketosis, y'all. Keto Comics.